Chapter 1. The Silence Before the Storm. The ticker tape at CNN pulsed like a warning beacon, its relentless glow casting a cold light across the darkened office in Kyiv. The words scrolled again and again, a grim mantra hammering into the minds of everyone watching. Trump announces pause on Ukraine aid pending investigation. The air grew heavy, the usual buzz of advisors and aides tapping feverishly at their keyboards, replaced by an eerie, suffocating stillness. At the center of the room, President Volodymyr Zelensky stood frozen, his eyes locked onto the screen as if it were a viper about to strike. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then, a whisper, hoarse, laced with dread. "They're choking us!" Foreign Minister Dmytro Kolesnik murmured, his hands clenched into white-knuckled fists at his sides. "Choking us slowly!" Zelensky didn't respond. He didn't have to. His mind was already racing, 1,000 thoughts colliding all at once. The soldiers shivering in the trenches, waiting for the weapons they had been promised. The families torn apart by war, clutching onto the hope that their country would not be abandoned. The shelling that never stopped, the destruction that never seemed to end. That fragile hope, the one that had kept Ukraine standing, was now hanging by a thread held not by Moscow, but by Washington, by Trump. He had always known that his relationship with the mercurial American president was precarious. Trump was a man who valued loyalty above all else, a man whose words could shift like a summer storm, changing direction without warning, without reason. But this was a betrayal, a calculated, deliberate move, designed to remind Ukraine exactly who held the power. Zelensky swallowed hard, forcing himself to remain composed. He thought of the Kremlin, of the men in Moscow who were watching this unfold, who were already celebrating. He thought of Putin, smiling over a chessboard where the pieces were being removed one by one, and he knew this was just the beginning. Chapter 2. The Game in Motion. The world held its breath. In Berlin, Paris, London, European leaders scrambled, issuing platitudes and hollow promises, their carefully crafted statements meaningless in the face of reality. Russia, predictably, purred, a cat watching a wounded bird struggle, playing the long game with quiet amusement. But the real theater, the place where the fate of Ukraine was truly being decided, was not Kyiv, not Moscow, not Brussels. It was Washington, D.C., and at its center, ensconced in the Oval Office, was Donald Trump, the man who held all the cards, and knew it. Inside the Oval Office, the atmosphere was tense, but familiar, a balancing act of flattery and self-preservation, where words had to be chosen carefully and reactions anticipated in advance. His advisors, a motley crew of true believers, pragmatists, and outright sycophants, navigated the treacherous waters of his attention with the precision of diplomats in a minefield. Among them sat Secretary of State Michael Pompeo, a man perpetually walking on eggshells, who had long since mastered the art of framing bad news as strategic genius. "Mr. President," Pompeo began, voice measured, "this pause on aid, its leverage, a calculated move to ensure accountability, to make sure Ukraine understands their obligations." He spoke carefully, emphasizing words Trump liked: leverage, calculated, accountability. But even Pompeo knew the truth. This wasn't about geopolitics. It wasn't about holding Ukraine accountable. Trump was playing a game, and Ukraine was the pawn. The so-called investigation Trump demanded was paper-thin, its purpose so transparent it barely qualified as a facade. He didn't care about Ukrainian corruption. He didn't care about the rule of law. What he wanted, what he needed, was dirt. Dirt on Joe Biden. More specifically, dirt on Hunter Biden and his dealings with Burisma, the Ukrainian gas company whose very name had become a political weapon. Trump saw it as a bludgeon, something to wield in the upcoming election, a narrative he could hammer into the public consciousness until fact and fiction blurred beyond recognition. This wasn't diplomacy. It was a power move, a transaction, the kind he had perfected over decades. And in his mind, the rules hadn't changed. Ukraine had something he wanted, and he had something they needed: simple, ruthless, effective. Chapter 3. The Impossible Choice. In Kyiv, under the dim glow of a single overhead light, President Volodymyr Zelensky sat at the head of a clandestine meeting, one that could decide the fate of Ukraine itself. The world outside moved forward unknowingly, but inside these walls, the air was thick with tension, each man in the room fully aware of the weight of the decision before them. Zelensky's mind raced. Trump had placed him in an impossible position. He had two options, both dangerous, both potentially catastrophic. He could cave to Trump's demands, sacrificing his own credibility and risking Ukraine's sovereignty. Once he opened that door, it would never close again. His government would be seen as compromised, a pawn of Washington, incapable of standing on its own. Or he could stand firm, refuse to be bullied, and risk watching his country crumble as the aid was permanently withdrawn. Without those weapons, without that support, Ukraine's military could collapse, and Russia would be waiting. No choice was clean. No choice was safe. But a choice had to be made. Seated around him were his most trusted advisors, the men who had stood with him since the beginning. Andriy Yermak, his steely, unflappable head of presidential administration, a man whose mind was a fortress of calculated diplomacy and quiet strength. Denis Shmyhal, the pragmatic prime minister, a man who understood power as a currency, who could see all the angles, all the costs. Kirilo Budanov, the fiery head of intelligence, a man who lived in the shadows, who saw the world not as it should be, but as it was, ruthless, unforgiving. Their faces were grim, their silence telling. The room felt smaller, the weight of history pressing against them. Zelensky finally spoke, his voice firm despite the tremor in his heart. We cannot give him what he wants. The words hung in the air, heavy, final. If we do, he continued, meeting each of their gazes, it opens the door to endless blackmail. We become puppets. A long silence followed. They all knew the truth of his words, but knowing and surviving were two different things. Chapter 4. Walking the Razor's Edge. The room was silent, save for the faint hum of distant traffic beyond the windows, the heartbeat of a city balanced on the edge of survival. Then, Kirilo Budanov spoke, his voice low, measured, unwavering. But without American aid, Mr. President, we're fighting a losing battle. His words carried the weight of grim reality, not speculation, not theory. Cold, hard truth. The Russians will bleed us dry. A chill settled over the room. Budanov had spent his life in the shadows, navigating the murky world of intelligence, watching leaders fall, nations collapse, and wars decided not just on the battlefield, but in back rooms like this one. He wasn't prone to panic, which made his warning all the more terrifying. The debate was brutal. Andriy Yermak, always the strategist, pushed for a delicate dance, a way to maneuver through Trump's demands without openly surrendering Ukraine's sovereignty. Denis Shmyhal, ever the pragmatist, shifted focus to securing alternative funding from Europe, but even he knew the truth. Europe's promises were slow, their actions even slower. Budanov, the hard realist, saw only one certainty. Without American aid, Ukraine was vulnerable, a lamb in a den of wolves. The room fractured into competing arguments, each path leading to a different kind of peril. But Zelensky listened, not just to their words, but to the unspoken fears beneath them. They were all right, and yet none of their solutions were enough. Finally, Zelensky made his choice. It was dangerous, but so was every road before him. They would weather the storm. They wouldn't give Trump what he wanted, no public statement, no endorsement of his demands. They would work through back channels, reaching key American allies, lawmakers, and media figures, ensuring that the American people understood what was at stake. They would expose Trump's machinations, but carefully. Not through direct confrontation, but through strategic leaks, subtle narratives, undeniable truths. It was a high-wire act, an attempt to outmaneuver the most powerful man in the world without provoking his full wrath. And if they failed, Ukraine would stand alone. The weight of his decision settled in his chest like a stone, but Zelensky didn't waver. He had played comedian, actor, statesman, but now he had to be something else entirely, a survivor, a leader, a gambler with his country's future on the line. And the game had just begun. Chapter 5. The Shadow War. The world of espionage came alive, a silent, invisible battlefield where information was the weapon and perception was the prize. In Kyiv, Kirilo Budanov moved like a ghost through the murky corridors of intelligence, activating his network with the quiet efficiency of a man who had spent his life in the art of deception. His strategy was simple, yet devastating. Not brute force, not open defiance, but carefully curated leaks designed to chip away at Washington's resolve while keeping Ukraine's hands clean. He fed stories to sympathetic journalists in the U.S., selective truths stitched together to paint a single, undeniable picture: a nation under siege, a democracy fighting for its survival against Russian aggression, a supposed ally, America, turning its back in its hour of need. The message was deliberate, potent. Ukraine was not just a victim, but a betrayed ally, a country left to wither by an American president who cared more about his own interests than the survival of a sovereign nation. In Washington, the whispers turned into headlines. Drip by drip, the State Department, fractured, bitter, filled with officials who had spent years fighting Russian aggression, began to leak from within. Confidential memos painted the picture of a president willing to sacrifice U.S. national security for personal political gain. Anonymous officials described high-level meetings where Trump dismissed Ukraine's pleas, focused only on what they could offer him in return. The intelligence community, still wary of Russian interference in past elections, sounded quiet alarms, feeding speculation that Trump's actions were not just reckless, but deliberately dangerous. By the time the Washington Post and the New York Times ran their explosive reports, the narrative was set. The world was watching, and Trump was cornered. The president's rage was volcanic. He watched the headlines roll in, his fingers white-knuckled against his desk. Fake news! The words exploded across his Twitter feed, his attacks relentless. The deep state is at it again, corrupt bureaucrats trying to sabotage America. Ukraine is lying. They've been stealing our money for years. Another witch hunt, just like Russia Hoax 2.0. But behind closed doors, his fury took a darker turn. In the Oval Office, he paced like a caged animal, turning to his most loyal advisors. Find out who's leaking. His voice was low, seething, deadly. And shut it down. I want absolute loyalty, or I want them gone. The message was clear. The war wasn't just in Kiev anymore. It was now being fought inside Washington itself, inside the White House, the State Department, the intelligence community, and Trump was ready to crush it by any means necessary. Chapter 6: The Gathering Storm. The message arrived just past midnight, a ciphered communication, intercepted from deep within Russian intelligence channels. Zelensky read it twice, then a third time, his fingers tightening around the fragile printout. The words were cold, clinical, devoid of emotion, yet dripping with intent. Moscow was moving. Russia had been watching, waiting, and now, with the pause in American aid, the signal was clear. Troops mobilizing, artillery shifting, supply lines reinforcing, a possible offensive being prepared. The pause in U.S. aid was more than a political crisis. It was a green light for Putin. America's hesitation was Russia's invitation. The Kremlin had seen this before, a divided West, a fractured response, a moment of weakness to be exploited. And now, Ukraine stood exposed, vulnerable, alone. Zelensky didn't hesitate. Within minutes, encrypted calls were placed to Berlin, Paris, London, Brussels, to every European leader who had once promised solidarity, who had vowed to stand against Russian aggression. He pleaded for assistance, weapons, financial aid, a clear, united front against Moscow. But the responses were lukewarm at best. Europe, divided and hesitant, was unwilling to risk direct confrontation with Russia. Germany stalled, caught between its economic ties to Moscow and its NATO obligations. France wavered, calling for diplomacy, for patience. Britain offered support, rhetorically, politically, but no hard promises. The EU debated, drafted resolutions, issued strong statements. But statements wouldn't stop tanks. Zelensky clenched his jaw, his fist, his resolve. They were afraid. Afraid of escalation, afraid of war, afraid of Putin. He had expected hesitation, but not this. Not this quiet, measured abandonment. The reality settled in his chest like a stone. He was alone. For the first time since the war had begun, truly alone. Chapter 7. The Turning Point. The shift came without warning, not from protests, not from leaks, not from international pressure, but from within Trump's own ranks. Senator Lindsey Graham, a stalwart Republican, a man who had spent years at Trump's side, returned from a fact-finding mission to Ukraine, and what he saw changed everything. The devastation was real, not just in reports or classified briefings, but in the faces of the people. He had stood in the rubble of bombed-out cities. He had met with commanders holding the line with dwindling ammunition. He had spoken with families who had lost everything, yet still refused to surrender. And he had seen what Washington had failed to grasp, that Russia was waiting, circling like a predator, ready to strike. This wasn't just about Ukraine. This was about power, influence, and America's place in the world. And if Trump let Ukraine fall, he wouldn't just be hurting Biden. He'd be handing Putin his greatest victory yet. When Graham returned to Washington, he didn't challenge Trump. He didn't lecture him. He knew better than to frame this as a moral fight. That wasn't how Trump operated. Instead, he appealed to what Trump valued most: strength, dominance, winning. Sitting across from him in the Oval Office, Graham spoke plainly, his voice even, calculated. "Mr. President, this isn't about the Bidens." Trump leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowed, his expression unreadable. "This is about national security," Graham continued. "Letting Ukraine fall plays right into Putin's hands. It empowers our enemies. It weakens our allies." Trump tapped his fingers against the desk, silent. He wasn't dismissing Graham. He was listening. "You want to be seen as the strongest president in American history, right? You want to be the deal maker? Well, if you let Putin win here, that's not strength." A pause. Trump's eyes flickered with something new. Not concern, not regret, but opportunity. Graham had given him a new path, a way to reframe the narrative. "You can still get what you want, Mr. President. You can say you forced Zelensky to make concessions. You didn't just give him aid, you made him work for it. That's not weakness. That's negotiation. That's power." Trump leaned forward, a slow grin creeping across his face. "Now that," he murmured, "sounds like a deal." In that moment, the calculus changed. Trump didn't reverse course out of principle. He didn't cave to pressure. He saw an angle, a way to turn weakness into strength, to sell the reversal not as an admission of defeat, but as a show of dominance. And with that, the gears of history shifted once more. Ukraine wouldn't fall, not yet, because Trump had found a way to make winning look like his idea all along. Chapter 8. The Summons. The invitation was a formality, but in reality it was a command, a summons from the emperor to his vassal. Zelensky had no choice. To refuse would be political suicide, a sign of defiance that Ukraine could not afford. The war still raged, the weapons still hadn't arrived, and Putin was watching, waiting for the slightest sign of weakness. So, he did what he had to do. He swallowed his pride, boarded the plane, and flew to Washington. The atmosphere in the Oval Office was suffocating, a room filled with power, expectation, and unspoken threats. Trump sat at the head of the room, flanked by his most loyal advisors, his presence exuding the confidence of a man who believed he had already won. Zelensky, across from him, felt the weight of the moment pressing down on him. Trump didn't waste time with pleasantries. He laid out his demands. "Mr. President, let's cut to the chase." His tone was casual, almost dismissive. "I need a public commitment from you. Ukraine needs to take a real stand against corruption." A pause, calculated, then the real ask. "And that starts with Burisma." The name hung in the air like a loaded gun. Zelensky's jaw tightened. He knew what this was. This wasn't about corruption. This wasn't about reform. This was about Biden. Trump wanted a statement, something he could use, something he could turn into a political weapon for the campaign trail. A public admission that Ukraine was investigating Burisma, a name synonymous with Hunter Biden. The moment Zelensky uttered those words, Trump could claim vindication, could sell the world a narrative of corruption at the highest levels of the Democratic Party. And Zelensky? He'd be nothing more than a pawn. Zelensky had no leverage. The aid was frozen. His military was outgunned. Europe had failed him. But he wasn't going to grovel. He crafted his response carefully, walking a razor-thin line between survival and dignity. "Mr. President, Ukraine has always been committed to fighting corruption. Neutral, safe. We will cooperate with any legitimate investigation into wrongdoing, wherever the evidence leads. Still safe, still vague. But then he drew his line. However, Ukraine does not conduct selective prosecutions. We are committed to transparency and the rule of law, and that applies to all cases, not just one. His meaning was clear. He wouldn't name Burisma. He wouldn't single out the Bidens. If Trump wanted a weapon, he'd have to find it somewhere else. Trump heard the words, and for a brief second, his expression flickered, a hint of annoyance, of recognition that Zelensky had ducked the trap. But it didn't matter. Trump had what he needed, a public statement, vague enough to spin however he wanted. He leaned back, a smirk curling at the edges of his lips. See? That wasn't so hard. He turned to the room, addressing the cameras before they were even rolling. President Zelensky has committed to fighting corruption. That's what we wanted, folks. Ukraine is stepping up. A grand gesture, a performance for the world to see. Because of this commitment, we're going to move forward with the aid package, with, of course, stricter oversight. The deal was done. Zelensky's statement was neutral, but Trump would frame it as a victory, a testament to his strength, his ability to negotiate, his refusal to be played. The aid would be released. But at what cost? Zelensky had survived the meeting, but he knew, deep down, the real fight was only beginning. Chapter 9. A Fragile Victory. The headlines exploded across the world, bold and triumphant. Trump releases Ukraine aid after Zelensky promises investigation. The market steadied, diplomatic circles exhaled, NATO quietly celebrated. The world breathed a collective sigh of relief. But beneath the surface of the victory, beneath the polished statements and relieved handshakes, the cracks remained. Because Zelensky knew the truth, this wasn't a win. It was a reprieve. He had averted disaster, but he had paid a price. His statement had been careful, deliberately crafted to avoid directly endorsing Trump's demand for an investigation into the Bidens. And yet, that's not how it was being spun. In Washington, Trump's allies celebrated the moment as a victory, parading the statement as proof that Ukraine was taking action. In Kyiv, critics whispered that Zelensky had played into Trump's hands, that he had given the American president exactly what he wanted, a headline, a talking point, a political weapon. He had salvaged his country. But had he tarnished his own reputation in the process? The flight back to Ukraine was quiet. His advisors spoke in hushed tones, some relieved, some still weighing the long-term damage. When Zelensky stepped off the plane, he was greeted as a hero. He had secured the aid. He had avoided war with Washington. He had outmaneuvered a political trap that could have swallowed him whole. But as the cameras flashed and the cheers rang out, he felt the weight of what lay ahead. He had survived the moment. But the future was uncertain. Trump could change his mind at any time. A single tweet, a sudden shift in political winds, and the support could vanish overnight. Russia remained an ever-present threat. The tanks, the artillery, the war machine had not stopped moving. And the world was still watching, still questioning. Was Zelensky the man who had saved Ukraine, or had he just bought it a little more time? The air in Kyiv was cold that night, but Zelensky knew the storm was far from over. Yudash Chapter 10. The Cost of Aid. The aid resumed, but it was no longer just money and weapons. It was a leash. The funds that Ukraine so desperately needed flowed again, but not without conditions. American advisors were embedded in Ukrainian ministries, watching every move, scrutinizing every transaction. Financial oversight teams reported directly to Washington, ensuring that not a single dollar was misused. Anti-corruption measures were no longer just a promise. They were mandated, enforced by men in suits who answered not to Kyiv, but to the White House. Zelensky chafed under the scrutiny. He was a president, not a puppet. Yet, he understood the cold reality. Ukraine was dependent on American support, and to survive, he had to play the game. Across the Atlantic, America made its choice. As the ballots were counted, it became clearer by the hour. Trump was winning. The same strategy that had cornered Ukraine, the same narrative of strength, had energized his base. His supporters saw him as the man who held foreign leaders accountable. His tough stance on corruption, though selective, was a rallying cry. His handling of Ukraine was sold as a victory, a masterclass in negotiation, a testament to his America First diplomacy. By the time the networks called it, The result was undeniable. Trump wins re-election. The crowds erupted. The victory speech was triumphant. And in Kiev, Zelensky stared at the screen, knowing what it meant. The game wasn't over. It was just beginning again. Chapter 11. The Price of Survival. For Zelensky, the victory was bittersweet, a triumph laced with chains. He had secured Ukraine's survival, but at a cost he could never fully measure. His country still stood, still fought, still clung to its sovereignty. But now its fate was tethered to Washington, bound to the unpredictable whims of one man, Donald Trump. No matter what Zelensky did, no matter how fiercely he defended Ukraine's independence, the reality was undeniable. His future, his people's future, was now a calculation in someone else's political game, and Trump's shadow loomed large. As winter's grip loosened over Kiev, a fragile thaw settled across Ukraine. The first signs of spring appeared, melting snow, whispering winds, the slow return of color to a land that had spent months frozen in uncertainty. But the frozen season had left its scars. A nation worn and wary, having learned that survival often came at the cost of principle. A president who had played the game and won, yet knew the rules could change at any moment. A world that watched, waiting to see if Ukraine had truly secured its future, or if it had merely delayed its fate. Zelensky stood at his window, staring over the capital as the streets slowly came back to life, knowing that peace was always temporary, that the next battle was already on the horizon. The game, he thought, his fists tightening at his sides, is far from over. And this time, he had no intention of being a pawn.